Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Naman Ahuja. I'm the editor of Marg Publications in Mumbai, and I'm also the Dean of the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU in Delhi. My areas of interest really are to do with intercultural exchanges and with the subject of art history. I specialize in the coming of iconography and when did images start being worshipped at the first instance and why? What led to the fundamental shifts in Indian culture that transformed the society into an image worshipping society? Along the way came the fundamental question about how do we approach these issues? And over the years, as a student and then as a professor, one's had the privilege to be able to work in a number of institutions. Early in my days as a student, I came here to the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. It must have been in the mid-1990s. And I plonked myself here in the library and I sat and studied, and I'm sure the register where students are meant to sign their entries and exits will have my name and signature in it somewhere or the other. And it was wonderful to be able to look through the material because this was a question that had actually first been raised by Bhandarkar himself. And one of his most famous books or monographs was on this very subject, on the rise of Shaivism and Vaishnavism, and explaining that, what were the shifts that were happening. And the privilege of being here was that this matter was being looked at comprehensively and not just looking at dating as it was coming out of ancient Sanskrit texts, but also looking at a lot of logic and archaeology and common sense, which are becoming rarer as we go along. So it was quite nice to be able to be here amongst various scholars and to be able to start my research here. And then over the years, once I became editor of Marg, it became quite interesting to be able to see the extraordinary archives that Marg had. Marg was created in 1946 by a group of avant-garde architects, art historians, Mulk Raj Anand, the literature. They all came together to be able to define a culture for the new India, knowing that independence was round the corner. Something had to be done to be able to think about India as a modern nation, an India that was going to accept and embrace modernity yet not lose touch with its past. And that required extensive documentation of the past because the requirement to be able to package and understand and research the past, to make it accessible, is something that we continue to face as a major challenge. So Marg started off as a quarterly, and we remain a quarterly journal, and we produce 4 issues a year. But other than that, we also produce monographs and books on a variety of issues. And since Marg and the nation were both turning and turned 75, it was time to do a little bit of introspection. 75 is a venerable age to be able to start looking within and wonder what you have really achieved in your lifetime, and what contributions you might have made, and perhaps what you could have done better also. And so at that moment, it was a great moment to take stock of what the organization had achieved. And we produced and are producing 5 readers, 5 books which are called Readings from the Archives of Marg, the first of which was Readings on the Temple. The next one was Readings on Textiles, which is what we're going to focus on today. And the third one is going to be Readings on the Modern, on the idea of the coming of the modern. What does modernism in the Indian context really mean? The fourth one is Readings on Dance, on classical Indian dance or regional Indian traditions or modern dance or contemporary dance. How much of it is a product of revivalism? How much of it is a continuity of tradition? Can tradition continue if the spaces and the patronage are no longer the same? So can it even be the same? And yet it conjures up an image of our past and our history. And then one has to also think about that, are we doing this only for the sake of nostalgia? Or does the past actually have relevance for us? And the last one in the series, as hard as the one on temples, because of the exhaustive nature of our archive, is going to be the one on Indian painting, pre-modern painting, that goes from Ajanta all the way through our many different traditions of miniature, so-called miniature painting and wall painting that we have in the traditions of the Mughals, the Dakhini Sultans, Pahadi areas, and Rajasthan. So that will be the last of our readers. Each of these readers is designed in a manner to be able to allow modern pedagogues, modern teachers, to know if they wanted to develop curricula, how they could approach the subject in today's environment. To not just say that is the right way because it was done by such and such scholar in the 1930s or 40s, but to say this was the concern of the nation, contextualize that piece of writing, and then look at it, that what are the current concerns and why are we revisiting that subject, and what new avenues are opening, what are the new questions for our times that are opening up. So, for instance, in the volume on temples, that incidentally was the very first Marg that was produced, and I've put down a quotation there from Mulkraj Anand on Inheriting the Past. He said, "As the discovery of India proceeds, we make efforts to inherit our past culture. We begin to realize that the gaps in our knowledge of the various historical periods are almost as vast as the centuries through which our ancient culture was built up." And of course, that is the mandate with which Marg started, to plug that gap. So as we started working on the volume on Indian temples, the first thing that we realized was that temples were not just made and used by Hindus. Well, that was a bit of a surprising statement to begin with, and to be able to see the vast numbers of Buddhist temples, or to be able to see the fantastic examples of Jain temples. The next issue that came up was, well, if you're working on temples, then are you going to write a book that is going to show that temples are not just limited to India? These are screen grabs. These are from pages of the volume, which I think is some copies of which, the copies almost sold out. I think we've got the last few copies are available for sale outside if anyone is interested. And we might go in for a reprint soon. So grab these if you can. This issue of Marg moves beyond the all too well-known Khajuraho, Tanjavur, Konark, to look instead also at temples in other parts of South Asia and what have been the decisive studies that have happened there. And they're fantastic little histories. The Nyatapol temple of Bhaktapur, it's all about competition in urban design. Can a temple be higher than the royal palace or not? What was the city skyline? There were urban design issues even 300 or 500 years ago about regulations for the city. And this is an article that deals with that. Moving into lands outside India, are we going to look at it as chauvinists who are going to talk about beyond the politics of conquest? That, oh yes, they were also inspired by Indian culture. They were also inspired by Indian culture. And Java has Indian culture, and Thailand has Indian culture, and Sri Lanka has Indian culture. Pat ourselves on the back all the time and then turn around and say, oh no, we believe in decolonization. We can't have double standards. We can't turn around and say that the British colonized us and that colonialism is bad, and then we ourselves are culpable of colonizing Southeast Asia and spreading our cultural ecumen in Southeast Asia. This was a problem for the early nationalists. And in the 1940s, they were very aware of this. And so the subject of Southeast Asian temple art and architecture was written about with far greater care, and the adjectives that were being used in the writing were used very carefully to be able to not let India be accused of being a colonial power, just as we were accusing the British of being a colonial power. So what was the difference? After all, we are all using English as a medium of communication, and these temple cultures were using Sanskrit or Tamil as their medium of communication. And if colonization is about the spread of culture and knowledge systems and language, then were we culpable of colonization too? These became very tricky questions at the rise of the Indian national movement, and they had to be dealt with. So when we talk about influence, whether in the field of ikat, or in the field of tie and dye, or whether we talk about it in the field of temple art and architecture, we need to be very careful in the language we're going to use, in how we're going to talk about these things. And so we bring that matter up. How are we going to give the countries in which this culture went their agency as innovators? Today, all of us who use English as a language, we consider ourselves the greatest literateurs in the English language. We don't wish to be regarded, Indian literature in English is not regarded as some kind of substandard literature. It's regarded as the pioneering literature of English in the world. And so, is a Javanese presentation of the Ramayana to be looked at as derivative, or is it to be looked at as their cultural expression? So these became issues with which we began to think about these matters and introduce these chapters. As I was saying, the issue of Marg moves beyond the all too well-known Khajuraho, Tanjavur and Konark to look instead at temples in Kutch, in Kashmir, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, Kerala, Southeast Asia, each with a unique style. We examined in this volume rock-cut temples, extraordinary wood, bamboo and brick temples. We looked at the whole question of circular temples, not just the square-planned ones. And we looked at modern multi-story and concrete and steel temples. Bewildering though they may be in their architectural range, this volume shifts our focus away from their variety to look instead at a core question, which is on who built temples in the first place and why. What were temples used for? Given that many Hindus don't believe in image worship, then what makes a temple a valid space for worship, and what legitimizes their public role? We examine the nature of these activities and the communities they fostered, and how, in turn, temples began to become the focus of urban centers. Ethnographic, historical, and comparative approaches are the fundamental ways in which we have gone about this volume. Temples, as this volume will show you, have adapted and changed over the centuries and served a variety of ritual functions. They have also been major centers of the arts: painting, sculpture, dance, and drama. To celebrate 75 years of Marg, this bumper issue brings together the writings of pioneering art historians who have deepened our appreciation of this hallmark of Indian architecture. Now, looking through the archive of Marg reveals shifts in the understanding of temples and how Indian art history has radically changed over the past 75 years. Many of our writers who were trained in what we now regard as old-fashioned colonial vocabulary, there was little hesitation amongst those writers to use terminology that we no longer find acceptable. So, for instance, the Aryan versus Dravidian nomenclature, for instance, remains deeply embedded in the public imagination even today and is something that warrants clarification. The earliest writings on the history, culture, and language of South Asia divided their subjects into Aryan and Dravidian. These two terms were associated with racially governed aesthetic and behavioral characteristics rather than being limited to, as we at BORI would say, to linguistic categories that we know them to be. Yes, right? As global speakers of English, as I was just saying, and even though all of us don't hail from the UK, we know that the language of one community can be naturalized to become the native tongue of someone from another part of the world to express their culture rather than be a communicator of Britishness. Right? Well, much the same way, in the case of Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, we already know that these communities were exchanging vocabularies in the second millennium BC. That's well over 2,000 years prior to the construction of the earliest temples. How then can this nomenclature be appropriate for describing discrete racial groups within their own cultural or aesthetic categories 2,000 years later? Why do we still use that terminology? All the more difficult it is to accept the writings of those with the colonial education with allusions to Aryan impulses or Aryan styles in art when referring to Indian temples and iconography. So even when trying to find a more progressive understanding of Indian culture, my predecessor, Mulk Raj Anand, was himself compelled to use this vocabulary. This was commonplace in all the old issues of Marg right until the end of the 1960s, when finally a more considered approach began to emerge in the writing. A single remark should suffice as an example. In December 1963, for instance, Mulk wrote, "The culmination of all the strains of civilization of more than 1,000 years of the Aryan-Dravidian fusion seems to be the basis of the Gupta classical renaissance." Right? Now, the problematic nature of this remark is not just limited to the use of Aryan and Dravidian, but the very binary understanding of Indian culture, as if it had only two constitutive elements. The history of its sheer variety or its plural origins thus gets oversimplified. The remark also reveals another bias which was held dear by art and cultural historians, which described the Gupta period as the great classical idiom of Indian art, a period which was previously thought to have revealed the oldest Hindu temples. Scholarship discussed the subject of the origin of the temple with far greater nuance. We now discuss it with far greater nuance. To trace the origins of each of the separate elements of Hindu temples, we must look more closely at Buddhist structures, where we get evidence of many features that are found in Hindu construction, making it relevant to see two traditions in parallel. For instance, the stupa may be accompanied by a dhvaj or a pillar with an animal capital, just as many temples are. They may both be sited at locations where there is a water tank or a tirth, at locations where there was a legendary event, or on a hilltop. Similarly, one of the forms of early Buddhist shrines is a chaitya cave, which often has an apsidal ground plan, that is, one which has a long corridor with a rounded or oval ending with a vaulted roof. This began to be used later as one of the standard types of temples as well. So the long history of the Gajaprishta, or apsidal temples, is traced to Buddhist chaityas, or for the square cell, in what is now called, what we call a kuta, is widely represented as a hermitage in ancient Buddhist sculptures, whether in Takshila or in North India. Finding Indian terminology was thus imperative for Indian art. For how could, and even why should, Indian art have to be explained in the Latinized vocabulary of Western art history? The rediscovery of Indian vocabulary was an integral part of the Indian national movement when generations of Indians had been alienated from their cultural foundations on account of colonialism. Scores of ancient texts were mined to find precise terms for iconography and architecture, and in the 1940s and 50s, the savants V.S. Agrawal and Moti Chandra began publishing lexicons of Indian art terms. The scope of understanding Indian art on its own terms was seen as not just being feasible but also necessary, and this became an active pursuit in the early decades of Indian independent India up until the 1960s. The project was revived under Madhusudan Dhaki and Michael Meister through the American Institute of Indian Studies, and the comprehensive Encyclopedia of Indian Architecture was then produced with elaborate glossaries of what these terms may have been. Now, while recovering a vocabulary of one's own was much needed, the exercise sometimes became excessive and very intimidating for students. The study of the Shastras describing these terms was looked at. There was a reaction to that by some scholars who said that this was all irrelevant, because according to some scholars, the terminology was arcane and at the best of times would only have been known to Pandits who were far removed from the ground realities of the builders, of the actual mistris, the craftspeople and the common public. They believed that studying ancient texts was not essential for a scholarly knowledge, was only essential for a scholarly knowledge of temples, but we should instead be looking at common vocabulary, common parlance instead. So came another problem. Should we use vocabulary drawn from Sanskrit or should we use regional texts? Did medieval Gujarati pilgrims, for instance, who visited Kanchipuram, use Tamil descriptive terms at the temple, or did they use Gujarati descriptive terms at the temple? Or were they using Sanskrit as the mediating language? Right? These become major questions for us today. Besides, only some of the most learned architects and artists may actually have read those Sanskrit texts, the majority of the artists and builders not having been familiar with that language. So at the same time, as many anthropologists and linguists have noted, practitioners groomed in a gharana or a guild inherit their knowledge by living in a milieu where adherence to tradition becomes all but instinctive. These debates are important, but they can be carried too far. I don't think these debates are purely academic. They should not be regarded as a diktat, that the Shastras should not be looked at as a diktat that limited creativity or the development of new styles or new kinds of images. Indeed, well into the 19th century, many new kinds of temples were being invented and created in the sacred city of Banaras itself. And this is a good example of one, where you could visit all the sacred shrines of Banaras by going to one temple. So rather like one of those pilgrimage textiles, where you would have all the sacred shrines and all the sacred sites present on one textile, which you could have darshan of. You could have darshan of the whole of Banaras by going to this one temple. Debate on the primacy of texts versus an understanding of practice has only been one of the major dilemmas that undergird the scholarly questions of the past few decades. Several editors of Marg greatly expanded the understanding of our field to parameters anew. Some volumes by Vidya Deheja deserve special mention. Royal Patrons and Great Temple Art, produced in 1988, was a landmark because it opened up a major aspect of understanding the reasons why royal people built temples and what public role they were trying to serve. Temples were often built at pilgrimage sites to celebrate a victory, but also in memory of someone. And so this memorialization is something that we have not actually paid enough attention to. That why people would create a public monument as a memorial shrine. And so the punya, or the good wishes, the merit that would accrue from the pilgrims would go to the memory of the ancestors, perhaps. The Deheja triangulated the institution of the temple with its patron, but also, and crucially, the artist and the craftspeople who conceptualized the entire edifice and provided the labor for the construction. So what do we know about the lives of the sculptors? And this is becoming a big subject in temple art and architecture now, because we've started seeing the masons' marks and documenting them. And this was earlier done first by Professor Shettar when he was looking at the material for the Hoysala temples, and then it began to expand and was looked at by Ramanath Mishra when he was looking at the Central Indian temples. And we now have a huge database of the number of shrines, and this is expanding, where we have masons and guild marks on these sculptures. So they're not just anonymous works of sadhana, but then we start coming into issues of patronage, like we do with textiles, or we do with dance, or we do with any other art, where you can imagine that artists might have been competing with each other to get the best commissions, right? So was it just an act of making something out of a sense of religious piety and only sadhana that was involved in the making? I'm not decrying it. I'm not saying that there wasn't piety, but I also have to have our feet on the ground and be realistic. Because if this was such a significant part of the economy where they were making temples for thousands of years, and in such large quantities of them, this must have been one of the most significant forms of employment in the country. If you think about how many people must have been stonemasons and sculptors in this region. So some of these issues are raised in this particular in these essays, along with some very tricky things, some marvelous temples, like did Byzantine architecture influence the construction of the Bhitargaon temple, which has the first representation of the true arch. It's one of those mysterious things. You know, for all of you who know architecture, the true arch actually comes up at Bhitargaon in South Asia first. And then it comes up again only 600 years later at Balban's tomb, where it comes in through the Islamic world. And so what was happening? The Romans had true arches, and the Byzantine cultures had true arches. And so was it that the Romans and the Byzantine cultures were in touch with the Guptas, and were there true arches earlier? And was it a tradition that was lost? Now, the one thing that this volume ends up proving is that temple architecture did not stay static, and it was a rapidly changing and advancing tradition, open to the traditions of the world, absorbing new ideas. We needn't lament, therefore, with the coming of steel into our modern temples. After all, temples have always been adaptive. And there isn't any one single type that is the pure or the correct type of temple, because throughout history there have been innovations in temples. And that brings us to one of the last segments of the book, which was quite a revelation. One of the things that Marg has really worked on is how do we know what we know about temples? And how have these temples survived? Jeernodhar is something that we pay very little attention to in our scholarly circles. Renovation and maintenance, repair, conservation is something that we don't talk about. We always talk about the one who does the udghatan, the one who comes in, puts the foundation stone for the building, but not the many people who have worked at maintaining that building over the years. How did something survive? Who was the continuing patron of that site over the next 500 years that kept those walls and bricks and painted it after every monsoon, put the dampness right after every monsoon, fixed that monument? Who were those people who kept that monument alive? And did they not make an intervention in that building when they worked on it? Did they not alter it? Or does it just remain the Gupta period temple as we see it now? And there's a big flaw in the way we teach, because we don't disaggregate portions of the temple and say, actually the foundations may be of this century, but that repair work and that wall and that is of this period, that period, and the other period. And so the temple as it now survives ought not to be simply linked with the year of its inception, but all the different years of its maintenance. Now this brings me back to the fundamental question of the idea that a temple can actually be anywhere you want it to be. And it doesn't really require all of these issues like construction according to a Vastu plan. And when does Vastu history itself start getting revived? So we deal with some of the rituals that went with these and some of the most extraordinary temples which don't even have a murti in the Garbhagriha. And what do those temples actually communicate and what do they mean? While talking about craftsmanship, one has to nowadays be very attentive to matters of caste politics and those who get included and those who get excluded. And the temples have been a space for a lot of political action. The Vaikum temple entry movement finally allowed lower caste people to be able to enter temples, which they were not allowed earlier. Or what is the right of a craftsperson who actually is the bronze caster, who cannot continue to work with the temple icon after it has been consecrated and can't touch it any longer. So what are their feelings and views about all of these matters? And that comes in. And then, of course, we have to deal with the colonial interregnum and what happens during that period through the ASI and the revivalism, through post-Curzon and what happens with our shrines and these issues. So the temples volume really brings up a number of these matters. In the volume, one of the key sites that I've tried to pay attention to in my selection was the site of Varanasi, because it was one of the most exciting sites to be able to study how trendy new styles of what we regard as Islamic art and architecture was so readily adopted and brought into the arches, the gumbads that are there all through Western India as well as into Central India. And the shift in the new kinds of temples, the courtyard temples that came up in, the Haveli temples that came up in Rajasthan and went up all the way into Lahore and in the Punjab as well. So it's interesting to be able to study some of those temples. We've looked at matters of pilgrimage. We've looked at a few temples in Pakistan, but not as many as we would have liked to have included. It was very tough to be able to make decisions. What you see on the right at Orchha is the interior of a temple, not of a mosque, in case anyone is mistaken about the matter. Temple spaces were not just architecturally important, but also bustling socio-economic centers. Often they were not limited to just one iconographic program relevant to one community, but were used simultaneously by several. They reinvented themselves to suit new exigencies, and this brings new religious imperatives to bear on a temple. They existed in a specific agricultural and hydrological environment, and today no studies can be complete without looking at the water management that temples were part of. The networks that these sites established take us to trans-regional histories connected with pilgrims, as well as those connected via trade to far-flung places that connected the Himalayas to Southeast Asia. And finally, we must situate them within the shifts in aesthetics, the intersections of material culture and performance culture, of being able to look at religion and art history, of ritual and its sensorium. Some stimulating essays here help interpret these subjects. And so we looked at the whole Gotipua tradition, the Devadasi tradition, and then the revivalism by Indian dancers of actually reconstructing Bharatanatyam and other dance traditions by looking at temples. And so dancers who would camp out at temple sites was very common in the 1950s, whether it was Damayanti Joshi living in Khajuraho for months on end, or it was Padma Subramaniam cataloging all the Adavus and Karanas, Chidambaram, to be able to reconstruct the entire sequence of Indian dance through what was seen on historic temples. So temples have proved to be a source for history writing for many other kinds of histories that were written. I must conclude by thanking our many patrons who managed to keep Marg alive and who have allowed this volume to be produced. It's been a great privilege to be able to, as a scholar, to be able to have access to this archive and to be able to start presenting for you all of these 5 different readers. I've given you a little snapshot of what we tried to achieve in the Temples volume, but in the conversation that's going to follow, I'm hoping that Monisha Ahmed and Mayank Mansingh Kaul will tell us more about the volume that they were a part of, which was the one on Indian textiles.